And we can see that these events between Naomi losing her husband and her 2 sons, it made her completely bitter at one point. You know, like it just made her like, probably the taste of God in her mouth was disgusting to her at one point. So he kind of goes and does that. The guy doesn't want to do it, you know, and it's a whole kind of, I guess you would say, like a small court hearing that transpires. You know, the guy has to take off his sandal. You guys could go back and read it for yourself, but it transpires to the point where Boaz is able to acquire everything that Elimelech have, and he gets Ruth as his wife also. So, you know, they go on, and that's how they end up having a son. And we know Ruth as the great-great-grandmother of David, who is in the lineage of Jesus Christ. But Ruth never would have reached her position if it wasn't for Naomi. And Naomi never, we would not even know about Naomi in the capacity that we know about Naomi if Ruth didn't stick with her and in return honor her. Because at this point, Ruth's husband was gone. So she didn't have to necessarily honor Naomi like her mother-in-law, but she did. And because she did, you know, Naomi inherits a grandson, and Ruth gets a husband and a son. And God uses both of these people in a mighty way after both facing a huge amount of trauma. But what I want to focus on with Naomi is that as they reach Bethlehem, where she's originally from, her town, her community does greet her. You know, they're like, oh, could this be Naomi, you know? And also because they probably heard about a lot of the disastrous things that have happened. But it's interesting because Naomi's response is, don't call me Naomi, right? Which means pleasant, you know, it means happy. She says, don't call me Naomi, but call me Myra, which means bitter, right? Or sour. And she also exclaims that the reason that her life has been hard is because God has made it that way. So I think what we see with Naomi is we see someone who's had a lot of traumatic events take place in their life. And at this point, they kind of feel like God's doing this to them for a reason, or maybe they have done something to deserve what's happening in their life. And that's not the case, but we see here this is actually a coping skill of Naomi's, because this is how she's dealing with it, you know. And this is not something that's too foreign, because if we fast forward into the New Testament, Paul is very much the same way about Christ. He believes in suffering for Christ. When people are asking him about his suffering and he's explaining it, he actually takes it as joy to suffer in the name of Jesus Christ. So Naomi is not necessarily using it in this way at this moment, but we see in the text, and the book of Ruth is not very long at all. I believe it's 4 chapters. You can read through it very quickly, and you can see that Naomi does start to turn the tide as Ruth and Boaz get together, and she inherits a grandson, and she starts to say, you know, like, God has redeemed Israel first, you know, and then me, like he's redeemed my family. So Naomi definitely has a reverence for God. She definitely has some love for God, but And all of that suffering, all of those traumatic events that took place, I don't think it is so foreign or so weird that that got lost for a second. You know, for a second. It didn't get lost forever, but for a second, you know, she truly feels like the trauma that has taken place in her life is because of God, because he is the one that either brought it upon her or he wanted it to happen to her or whatever she's thinking at this moment. And then we see God redeem her completely to where, like, we see Naomi in such a light. You know, she's used and she's talked about in such a way because that redemptive story is not only about Ruth, but it is about Naomi as well. And I think that I love that we get to see Naomi turn and then talk about how God has redeemed her and no one else, not herself, not Ruth or Boaz, but it was God himself. And I think that there's a lot to that because we are doing this trauma series and we're going through trauma and we're talking about, you know, rape and molestation and kidnapping and all kind of things, you know, childhood abuse and just being taken for granted. We're talking about all kind of traumatic events that a person can deal with. And then we also want to look at how can these things play out in their life. And we can see that these events between Naomi losing her husband and her two sons, it made her completely bitter at one point. You know, like it just made her like probably the taste of God in her mouth was disgusting to her at one point. But I think this is something that many of us can relate to because many of us have gone through things and we find ourselves asking, why did that happen? Or why did you let that happen? Or why did you do this to me? It's not God's fault, but in the midst of that sadness and that brokenness and that pain that we feel, we do find ourselves kind of acting like Naomi. I know I have. I don't know, you guys might be holier than me, but it's happened to me before. And I just love this redemptive story of these two women. We're not focusing on Ruth today, but we know Ruth has an extremely redemptive story because we know the book of Ruth. We see the book of Ruth in the Bible, and some of this is what it's about, what I'm talking about right now. But Naomi does play a huge part in it, and I just wanted you guys to see that. Even to the point of this woman, I mean, this is back-to-back traumatic events, right? First my husband, then my two sons. You know, like this is, I mean, I think any woman that might have even come close to dealing with a situation like this probably is saying right now, I couldn't even imagine. You know, so these are some pretty traumatic events for Naomi to face. And like we talked about early on, her having to leave her hometown to go to a foreign place because of a famine, not even because they picked up and they wanted to buy a house in a different neighborhood, because they had to, right? Immigrants at this point, basically. So a lot of these events, and then we see the bitterness, but I love how we see her turn and her say like, no, it's God who has redeemed me, right? God redeemed my family. And I think that we could take a lot from this because regardless of what we go through, even in losing family members, even in losing all that we know, having to leave where we're comfortable and go somewhere different, God still sees us. You know, God is still there to redeem us once we turn back to him. And I think that if we look at the story of Naomi, we see a beautiful picture of that. So I really hope you guys take something from this and you enjoy this. Share this with someone who has experienced a lot of trauma, maybe through death, you know, maybe through a lot of loss, maybe through having to migrate somewhere where initially they didn't think they would end up or they would have to go. So share this with someone who you guys know this will help. I love you guys. Stay tuned. We will be back very soon with the next person. I'm not going to reveal it, so you got to stay tuned. Take care of yourself, guys. And what do I always say? Love yourselves, love one another, but most of all, love God. Peace.